Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily podcast, where once again we're going to dive deep into the confluence of technology and real-world examples. I'm your host, Neil C. Hughes, and today I have an exceptionally insightful episode lined up for you because joining me is Monish Darda. He's a CTO and co-founder of Icertis, which is a trailblazing company that's managing over 10 million contracts worth more than $1 trillion, all with a sharp focus on harnessing AI, machine learning. And as a result, today's guest is at the forefront of transitioning how businesses approach things like sustainability in supply chains. And in the wake of EU's corporate sustainability reporting directives and the UK sustainable disclosure requirements, it seems that companies over here in the UK at least and Europe are compelled to demonstrate tangible efforts towards reducing their climate impact. And that can include not only their operations, but also the environmental footprint of their supply chains. So today's guest is going to shed light on how AI is revolutionizing this domain and also offering a few innovative ways to quantify and minimize the environmental impact of supply chain partners. And if we've got time, we will also explore how companies can no longer resort to greenwashing and they must showcase genuine efforts towards achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So get ready for an engaging session where we explore the intersection of AI, machine learning, sustainability, and corporate responsibility, and we'll do it all inside 30 minutes. But enough from me. Let's get him on the podcast now. So a massive warm welcome back to the show. For anyone that missed our first conversation, can you just tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
First of all, Neil, thank you for having me on the show. Looking forward to this. So I'm Monish Darda. I'm the CTO and co-founder of Icertis. We are a contract lifecycle management company. And I actually run all of the AI, all of the engineering, keep us honest. But more importantly, with all of the stuff that's happening, including generative AI, I try to keep the chaff from the meat. And that is sometimes very hard to do and it's a full-time job. So I enjoy that.
Fantastic. And you mentioned AI there, and obviously it's all everyone's been talking about this year. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to bring you back on here to talk about things like machine learning in contract analysis. So how is machine learning being leveraged at Icertis? I was reading how you analyze millions of contracts. So I'm curious what you do there and what role that analysis will play in ensuring environmental commitments are upheld by both businesses and their suppliers.
No, it's very interesting. And first of all, maybe I can spend just a minute on what contract management is, and then see how AI applies to it. So Icertis, where we do contract lifecycle management and what we call contract intelligence, allows large enterprises to manage their contracts and their contract processes. And think Microsoft, think Mercedes-Benz, think Google, think Johnson & Johnson. So these large corporations have millions and millions of contracts, and we help them manage the whole process of the contracts, allow them to understand what is in the contract, set up the intent correctly and memorialize it in the contract, and then make sure that they deliver the intent of that contract in the real world. So that's what we do. Contracts are all about commitments, and we manage those commitments. We manage the terms in the contracts. We manage the attributes in the contract. And if you think about it, a contract is a set of rules. That is how a business runs. Without rules, you can not exchange money. You cannot pay anyone. You cannot get paid. You have to be compliant. For that, you need contracts, and we manage that whole process. Now, what is interesting with AI is if you look at especially with machine learning, and then more recently, of course, generative AI and ChatGPT and all of the interesting work that is coming out because of these transformers, it is more about how to understand language, and contracting just fits right in because contracting is all about understanding language and then delivering value as that language is interpreted in the real world. And contract language can be complex, right? It can be tedious. It can be hard to understand. Contracts run into hundreds of pages sometimes. So what we do is we apply AI to these contracts to make them easier to understand, to turn all that unstructured data into structured data. Then take that data and make sure you apply more AI on top so that you can make decision making easier, so that you can get insights as you're negotiating, as you're paying an invoice, as you're asking your customer to make sure that they are happy, making sure that the commitments that you have for your customers are being delivered, working with governments, making sure that you're compliant with all of the regulation that inundates the world nowadays, making the world globally a complex place to do business. And that is, the first step to that is through the contract. And we help manage these enterprises, help the enterprises manage these contracts.
And with the recent implementation of the EU's corporate sustainability reporting directives, I'm curious, how do you foresee changes like that impacting companies, particularly in terms of things like supply chain transparency and sustainability? Because a big talking point right now, isn't it?
It is. It is a huge talking point, and this is just the beginning. Yeah. I think there'll be more and more companies that take on sustainability, the whole ESG, making sure that it's the governance across ethics, across social, across corporate, making sure that all of these enterprises follow all of the principles and the regulation that is popping up in different countries. And this is exactly this. If you're looking at doing business, you have to make sure that you are giving that transparency to regulating authorities, to your customers, to your vendors, to make sure that there is transparency across the supply chain. And that is what is making a difference here, primarily because once you get into that kind of a compliance thing, you have to make sure that your supply chain opens up. You have to make sure that your commitments open up, that you have to make sure that your commitments that your suppliers give you open up, and their suppliers, and this can be a long, difficult chain. And the first link to kind of manage those kinds of commitments and to comply with this kind of regulation is to make sure that your contracts are in order, because the contracts actually are the starting point to say what can and cannot be done and what is the recompense if something does not happen the way it should. And that makes people kind of be disciplined about how they manage their processes, including their production processes, delivery processes, and their sourcing processes.
And on behalf of any business leader from any industry listening to this conversation anywhere in the world, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges that organizations face in reducing their climate footprint within their supply chain? And how do you see AI and machine learning solutions helping overcome these challenges? Because we hear a lot about the buzzwords, but it'd be great to hear how this technology can make a real difference.
No, absolutely. So think about, all companies, first of all, kind of trying to clean up that supply chain, so to speak. If you look at Mercedes-Benz, for example, they're going right up to the cobalt that goes into their electric car batteries to make sure that it is sustainably sourced. If you look at companies like Starbucks, they're looking at the supply chain and figuring out whether the coffee that they use is sustainably sourced. So all of this actually goes very deep into how companies do business today and how they source through their supply chain. So if you look at these concrete examples, it's a fairly difficult challenge. Not just reporting, but actually where do you start? How do you make this happen in the real world? It's a fairly complex problem. Most companies put a program around their initiatives, sustainability initiatives, and these programs can run multi-years, 5-10 years, before they can clean up all of their supply chain and make sure they make sense out of the supply chain. Now, one of the building blocks of any of these initiatives is, hey, when I decide to, let's say, make sure that my supply chain is sustainable across the board and make sure that the corporate sustainability reporting directives are met by making sure that I can report against, how I'm doing my sourcing and my production sustainably, is to make sure that the contract between you and your supplier, between you and your partner, between you and your customer has those clauses built in, because that's the first step. That is how, for example, when you set up the law, you can make sure people comply. The contract is the law, and that is where contracts come in. That is where obviously once contracts come in, AI follows, because now you need to understand the language. You need to discover what is in contracts that are sent to you, that are not necessarily, as they call it in legal terms, on your paper, and make sure that this whole chain, right from your selling to your procurement, is all connected through the contracting portfolio so that your sustainability can be more transparent. And that is where, most of these transformation initiatives, most of these compliance initiatives have to begin.
And I'd love to find out a little bit more about your role in these sustainable business practices. So as the CTO of Icertis, can you tell me a little bit more about how your platform aids companies in both aligning with new sustainability reporting requirements and also, of course, managing those contractual obligations related to the environmental impact? Because these are things we don't get to hear and talk about that much.
That is right. And I think it's very interesting because we, in Icertis, we have what we call the Icertis Contract Intelligence Platform, which can manage contracts and can manage the obligations within them, and then make sure that the transactions that happen on those contracts can be checked against what is inside the contract. So let me give you an example. So you have these sustainability initiatives, you have certain clauses that are required to go into a contract. If you have 50,000 contracts that you do every year all across the world in different languages and with different suppliers globally, then you have to make sure that you have a common way of interpreting and enforcing some of these terms. So it starts with, how do I take these terms and how do I apply them to all of my contracts across my supply chain globally? And every country is different. Every, you have a global for, what your company believes in. Then you have local regulation that you have to comply to. And then all of this becomes fairly complex as the contracts are in, all across the world for these global companies. So making sure that you use AI to go through contracts that are signed, to make sure that these are built in, the ethical sourcing, for example, sustainable sourcing, all of these directives that go into the contract have to be rationalized, and this rationalization can be very easily and very effectively done by AI. So once you do that, the second part is to make sure that it goes to the next level of the supply chain. So for example, if you are manufacturing a car and you tell someone to manufacture the battery, then does that supplier actually have very similar clauses that go to their supplier so that you have compliance that flows back to you? Do they source ethically, their suppliers? Do their suppliers source sustainably? Is something that you can enforce through a contract. That's your first step, right? And then you enforce on the ground what is happening against that contract. So setting up that chain, that is also where AI comes in, because you can actually go and figure out who supplies to whom, what are the suppliers, what are the terms, how do I get those terms back, how do I rationalize them, how do I first find them, of course, and then rationalize them and make sure that your supply chain becomes more transparent over the years. The second step after you get, the terms is to make sure that the transactions that happen comply to those terms. So if you get a shipment of lights that go into your car or a set of batteries that go into your car, does that come along with a certificate, for example, or a testament that, hey, this manufacturing across the supply chain that went in is actually kind of sustainable and actually has the clauses and has been built according to the specifications of those clauses. And that makes it interesting because now you're trying to do something a little bit more deeper, and you have to dig into reports, you have to dig into data that is available on the web publicly, you have to deal with data that is available from these companies that provide data about risk and sustainable practices in different companies and in different countries, and make sure all of that comes in. And that's where AI can help as well, because now you can go through all of that data and figure out, what you get is actually what you set out to do in the first place when it comes to ethical and sustainable procurement. And that's how we help our customers as well. We do both of these steps, and we make sure that they can actually set up practices that work in the real world.
And another big topic right now that makes a lot of business leaders nervous is greenwashing. So in light of the UK's sustainable disclosure requirements and, of course, similar initiatives around the world, how can technology, particularly AI, play a role in combating greenwashing and promoting genuine sustainability in business practices? Because that's where we need to get to, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And if you think about what happens in greenwashing is essentially there is less transparency, which means that it is very easy to cover up, some of these practices where you're not actually getting what you set out to do from a ethical and sustainable procurement perspective. And more transparency in this chain actually helps stop this practice. And if you think about it, that's where, ESG transactions actually need contracts. And we've seen that over the past 2 years, 5% of adoption has been more because of the role of contract management resources, how you kind of figure out how your contracts are. Only 14% of all the businesses have actually made the connection between the contract and their sustainability and ethical sourcing practices. And that's where that shift is happening. More and more businesses are seeing that you can actually bridge that gap and make sure that you can bring in more transparency, at the same time protect your business from the outcomes of these regulations, of not following these regulations in different countries, including the UK. And that is where also governments come into play. Governments also, of course, the regulation makes things more complex, but the government also helps in terms of figuring out, hey, what kind of reporting is required that triggers what kind of discovery you need to do in your supply chain to stop greenwashing. And we do a bit of that as well, because as soon as you go understand the contract, as soon as you see that these clauses are properly feeding into the supply chain, once we get a visibility into the supply chain for the person who is responsible, for the department who is responsible for complying to regulation, things become easier. Reporting becomes easier. And adherence to the reporting and the actual meaning behind the act and the regulation becomes easier.
And I think 2023 will be remembered as the year where both AI and sustainability entered the mainstream. It's all everyone's been talking about, and we're now looking forward to 2024. So how do you envision the role of AI and machine learning evolving, especially in the context of environmental sustainability and corporate responsibility too, of course?
Well, there are two important things that are happening according to me. First one is the AI regulation that is coming in, right? How will governments worldwide, including the EU, including the US and the rest of the world and the UK, actually figure out how to use AI and what are good AI practices? And you'll see more and more regulation come in to govern how AI is used. Now that becomes very interesting because, these problems around sustainability are also complex problems, and they also need AI to work to actually implement how these regulations are met in practice. So I think what we'll see in the next year and the year after is that, especially for these kinds of use cases like sustainability, AI becomes a very contributing factor, very important factor, and that will set the tone for how AI is going to be used. So a lot of the AI regulation figures out, hey, what kind of applications are good applications for AI? What kind of applications are risky applications for AI? Which kind of cross the boundary of human interaction, which cross the boundary of personal freedom and freedom of choice and so on. And on the other hand, the problems of sustainability actually find a very good home for AI. And I think because of these becoming two things independently becoming extremely important across the world, and coming into the public eye as well, I think it will help AI become the technology, really realize the potential of that technology much more easily, because this is such a great example of how technology can be applied to do good in the world, to actually make something happen, which, all civilized nations are interested in. And I think that is what we are going to see more and more. 2024 will be a lighthouse example of how AI can be used to solve a problem that is confronting the world today in terms of sustainability. And that will make AI better. That will make the adoption of AI better, not just the technology, of course, but the adoption of AI better. And that will also set the stage for better AI regulation and more practical and pragmatic AI regulation for the future. So it's very exciting. I'm looking forward to the next 2 years on how these two initiatives across the board globally come together for many organizations.
It really is exciting. And I do think, though, much of what we're talking about today will be daunting or even overwhelming as we begin to navigate these uncharted waters. And businesses, by in large, they want to do the right thing, but they need a little guidance. So what advice would you give to companies that are preparing to adapt these new sustainability reporting requirements? How should they approach integrating things like AI and machine learning into their sustainability strategies? Any advice you can offer around that?
Yes, there is lots of experience. More than advice, it is my experiential learning that we've got working with some of the largest companies in the world. When you look at some of these initiatives, they can be daunting to start with. So, of course, you have to break them down and make sure that you start with baby steps with a larger objective in the future. The first thing is to simplify. The second thing is it's not just about adopting and adapting technology to solve a problem. It's not just about AI. It's also about, hey, what do I do when I get insights from the AI? What do I do with the technology in the real world? How do I make sure that my business process actually runs better? I think one of the things, if we look at history, is when regulation comes in. It could be regulation that actually puts more barriers for entry for businesses or doing business. It makes businesses more complex sometimes, but sometimes it's also an opportunity. So looking at your transformation, looking at your initiative, not just from a technology angle, but seeing opportunities to transform your business in some ways so that you can not only be compliant, but also be better, looks like becomes a smart move. And, really organizations that lean into the future and are forward thinking start with that approach. And I'll give you a very simple example, right? When you go to a hotel room, usually 10 years ago, I never thought, when I use a towel, would I throw it on the floor and would it be cleaned and washed the next day? But today, every hotel room, you see there's a small plaque which says, hey, we care about the environment. Mm-hmm. So if you don't need to wash the towel, please make sure that you don't leave it on the floor. You hang it up and so on, right? So there is a way of making sure that you actually save money because the hotels save money, but you're also being nice to the environment. The guest that comes into the hotel room feels good and everyone wins. And I think sustainability also has to be looked at from that lens. And that's where, in my mind, I've seen the use of Icertis contract intelligence in a very smart way. Because the first thing to do is to set up this expectation with people. And contracts do this very well, right? So when you're signing a contract with a supplier or a customer and you say, hey, we believe in this, we believe in a better world, in a better future, and that's why we need these clauses in the contract, people reciprocate. And that sets the tone for your business. And that helps people do better in their everyday lives. And that comes back from the supply chain into your business. And that helps you also comply to the directives. So I think it's a huge benefit for companies to think about, how do I turn this into an opportunity? How do I twist this regulation as opposed to meeting the regulation and filing a report to how do I make changes to my business so this becomes part of my business? And I think that becomes extremely, extremely important and extremely, extremely useful for companies going through this journey. One other thing that I see, great companies do is to make sure that they put the guardrails in as much automation as possible, but make sure that you don't hinder the business by providing a way to make an exception and have an exception process where a human comes in, so that even when you apply AI, you apply it to automate, but you don't try to automate 100%, because that becomes very hard and sometimes even impossible. So you do the 70-30 rule, you automate for 70%, you look at the 30% extension and you build your business flows according to those exceptions so that they can be handled properly. And that makes bringing this technology together a lot more effective and a lot more rewarding when it comes to not just adhering to regulation, but also adhering to the spirit of the regulation.
And you mentioned your experience there, and I'm conscious we've talked a lot about where we are now, where we're heading, the future, and the great difference we can make with technology. But before I let you go, I want you to look back at your career, looking back through some of that experience, because I suspect you've picked up more than a few war stories over the years. So is there a funny or interesting story that has happened in your career that we can leave everyone listening with today?
Oh, we have lots of stories. It's been a fun journey, and it continues. I've been an entrepreneur all my professional life. Icertis was my 7th startup. So I've always been either a very early employee or a co-founder or a founder of a company for all of my professional life. And there are so many stories. That's why I enjoy what I do. But one, I remember in the early days of Icertis, which taught me a lot too, of course, and was very funny as well. I thought it was something special. Was when we had a large car company, automotive manufacturer in Europe. We were very small. We were about 25 people at that time. And we got this email in our inbox in info@icertis.com saying, hey, we are interested in your contract lifecycle management system. That at that time, it was not contract intelligence. We called it CLM. And they said, we are interested. And we said, is this a fake email? Why would this large company be interested in little Icertis? But we've checked, and it was actually a real invitation. So I go to Germany to meet all the senior folks. They invite us for a demo and a presentation. And I have one salesperson who was based in Zurich, and I traveled to Europe to meet the customer. And he told me, hey, these folks are Germans. Don't crack any jokes. They'll all be in suits and ties. Make sure you're proper. Just tell your story. Be serious. And then if there are any questions, answer them straight. Don't try to crack any jokes. And I said, okay. And I was decked up. I was, suit and tie and everything else. And I walk into this room full of people at the customer, 15 people wearing jeans and t-shirt. And it was a revelation. They said, hey, we've changed our culture, We want to be like companies in the Bay Area. We want to be like the Apples and Googles of the world. And the first thing we thought was, hey, we'll change how we work and how we dress. And so I had a great time, by the way. We had a great presentation. We had 45 minutes. It went on for 1.5 hours. People loved it. I enjoyed it. But it's just that sometimes, you go into a meeting, you go into a situation with a certain mindset, and it's so important to be open when you go in. And this was hilarious. I was laughing the whole day, but we had a lot of fun, and we also had a lot of learning there.
Absolutely lovely. What a great story. And for anyone listening, just wanting to find out more information about anything that we talked about today, and maybe even contact your team if they've got any further questions, where would you like to point everyone listening?
Oh, certainly our website, https://www.icertis.com. We are, of course, on LinkedIn. Icertis, Icertis is the name. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, Monish Darda.
Well, love chatting with you today and discussing how AI is being used to quantify the environmental impact of organizations' supply chain partners, but also reduce the climate footprint within the supply chain. And not only that, expanding on how machine learning can be used to analyze literally millions of contracts to ensure environmental commitments are followed by a business supplier, as well as the business itself. But more than anything, I think that, and finishing off with your warm and very amusing story, just a a big thank you for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Neil. I enjoyed being on it.
Wow, we covered so much in a short amount of time there, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything we talked about, because it will impact every business. And I appreciate that we are entering uncharted digital waters. It can be daunting, overwhelming. Some businesses are further along than others, and I'd love to put all of your insights and expertise into the melting pot, and maybe we can all learn from each other. So please email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, just @Neil C. Hughes. Nice and easy to find. Send me a quick message. Don't just hit the follow button, and we'll keep the conversation going. But that's it for today. So a big thank you to today's guest. Even bigger thank you to each and every one of you for tuning into this podcast every single day. So thanks for listening, and until next time, don't be a stranger.